what I have here on the light board is our hierarchy for movement development. This is how myself and our strength staff and our coaches and how we teach coaches and athletes in seminars to dissect movement and how to improve movement. This is a global system for improving movement. It's not specific to any one thing, but I want to walk you through the thought process behind why we prioritize these buckets. So the way this list is ordered is from global effect in order of greatest to least. So that's not to say that breathing, for example, is going to fix all of your shoulder or hip problems, but the global effect of better breathing will have a bigger effect on the hip structure than just improving the hip mobility, for example, whether it's internal, external rotation, abduction, adduction, what have you. And we'll dive into that a little bit deeper here. But our hierarchy goes in order, and we can kind of lump this first bucket into spinal mechanics, trunk stability and spinal mechanics. Of trunk stability and spinal mechanics, we have breathing, we have bracing, and we have intra-abdominal pressure. Now those things are all a little bit different, but they all work together to create trunk stability. A lot of people think about bracing as just flexing your abs, but really bracing is two things. It's actually bracing. Bracing is a reactive strategy that your body uses to stabilize. Think, for example, if I were to go and punch you in the stomach, or if you got punched in the stomach, the reactive flexing that you would do, that's actually bracing. Now, intra-abdominal pressure has more to do with breathing, and it has more to do with trunk pressure. Breathing is a catalyst to intra-abdominal pressure, and that's why it's so important. Trunk stability is going to be our number one bucket here, and I'm not going to have a whole lot of time to go into great detail on any of these things, but I'm hoping to put these together in a little bit more of a series moving forward after this one session. Our second big bucket is the feet. Now we say feet, but what we really mean is the foot complex. That's going to be the foot, the ankle, and the lower limb. Lower limb talking about this structure from knee down. That's going to be bucket number two. The reason that that's important for us is because all forces that enact on the body when you're standing or when your feet are in contact with the ground have to have some type of ground reaction force to be able to distribute back into a barbell. This is exceptionally important, especially when we look at the hip structure. The foot really tells the hip a lot about what it should be doing in loaded movement. And when we talk loaded movement, I'm often referring to barbell exercises. This is going to be your squatting, deadlifting, even anything where we're moving, in fact, whether that's lunges or what have you. The foot and the hip really work in concert together, ultimately to tell the knee what to do. That's why you don't see real specific joints on here besides the shoulder. And when we say shoulder, we're really talking about the shoulder complex, the thoracic complex. That's going to be T-spine, shoulders, scapulas, everything within that realm. Now, after feet, we have the hip and shoulder complex. Now, the hip and shoulder complex, we think of our two big movers of the body. They're the areas that really should be producing the most amount of force in your loaded movement. The spine should not be producing a whole lot of force and movement. If it is, you're going to have a lot of trunk movement, and that could come in the form of a lot of extension, a lot of flexion, things where the spine has to go through one or two of those phases to be able to complete a movement. The spine and the foot, really, they don't produce force. They act as force conduits. They act as the highway of force that is generated from your bigger movers in the hip complex and in the shoulder complex. Now, the hip and shoulder complex are where people experience the most amount of issues. Not too many people, unless you're dealing with low back pain or other things, are going to have a whole lot to do with the spine. Low back injuries certainly, it's the number one health cost in America, but typically the nagging injuries that we experience in a lot of our lifters are more so to do with the hip and shoulder complex because they're so diverse and they perform many different actions within loaded movement. So our order in terms of things that we fix first in individuals is breathing, bracing, spinal mechanics. That whole bucket is number one. Foot, ankles, number two, and then hip and shoulder complex is the last thing. Now, as experienced coaches, once we know why this system is set up the way that it is, and unfortunately I don't have enough time to go through the totality of it here today, you can certainly just jump to the hip and shoulder complex to work directly on that. You can jump right to your hip stability drills, right to your shoulder stability drills, and you can clean those things up. However, we're looking at more long-term improvements. We want I'm hesitant to say permanent improvements. We want things that last a little bit longer. Think about when you go and foam roll your IT band. If you're someone who feels like you have to foam roll your IT band every single squat session, you do not have an IT band problem. You have something that's driving that problem. If the thing that you're doing to fix the issue is always reoccurring, you're always, or you're likely not addressing the root cause. And what we're getting after here is addressing root causes of problems. Now, you might ask, why are spinal mechanics more important than hips? Think about one of the most common things that everybody struggles with. That's going to be an anterior pelvic tilt, or even a posterior pelvic tilt for some people. Most people have this forward tilted pelvis, a little bit of spinal extension, kind of this outward like chest position. That's very, very common, especially amongst our strength athletes. And the fix that a lot of people do for that is they go, okay, I know that in this pelvis posture that I have probably shortened hip flexors, so as my hip flexors tight and short, my quads are tight and short, and I know that my abs, maybe they're weak, and maybe my low back is a little tight. So what they typically do is they're going to go in and they're going to stretch their hip flexors, they're going to stretch their quads, maybe they'll do a little ab activation work, and they think the problem is fixed, but it's really not, because the way that the pelvic tilt was created, there's a lot of reasons that it could have been created, but it's all going to be driven through what the lower back does in loaded movement. So think about a squat. You can have great pelvis posture and really excellent mobility, but if your breathing and bracing is really terrible, and by terrible I mean it just isn't that effective, the first thing that your spine's going to do is find a position of leverage, and that's going to be a position of tension. It's typically going to be found in excessive extension or excessive flexion. Now, the problem with that as it relates to the pelvic tilt example or the hips is that extension of the lumbar spine immediately tells the hips what to do. The hip complex is completely dependent on what the lower back tells it to do. So if your lower back extends in a squat, you will always have a pelvic tilt in a squat. It's impossible to not have a pelvic tilt if you have a massive amount, not even a massive amount, if you have a almost any amount of lumbar extension in a squat, you are going to experience some type of a pelvic tilt in your squat. So the fix, though, is not to fix hip flexor, and it's not to fix quad, it's not to foam roll, it's to fix trunk stability, because trunk stability was the driver of that pelvis position. And that's just one example of this, but that's why we prioritize these things first. Now, a lot of people say too, maybe I have an inward caving knee in a squat. Maybe I really roll to the outside and I have this big external rotation in my squat and I kind of get stuck 2/3 of the way up. A lot of people experience many knee issues in the squat, and so that's typically the first thing that they want to jump to. And I'm using the squat and like hips as an example just because they tend to be the most common. But the first thing a lot of people do when as it pertains to like knee cave or a knee valgus position is they go, okay, I know that knees in is bad, so I need knees out, which is probably correct. But the way that they go about getting that knee out position is they go, okay, I need to do monster walks, I need to do hip external rotation work, I need to do clamshells and things of that nature. But in reality, those things are only addressing the hip. And as we said, the foot is bucket number 2 for us, but the foot and hip together tell the knee what to do. And we can do a whole lot of really good stuff at the hip complex, but again, going back to our priorities, lumbar spine tells hips what to do in our squats and deadlifts. But as it pertains to the knee cave issues, if we only address hip and we jump immediately to hip here and do external rotation work, we might not ever discover that the real cause of that knee cave problem was excessive foot pronation or even excessive foot supination. What that kind of looks like is like really rolling out in your squat with your feet, or even really rolling in your squat. As soon as your foot changes position in a squat, for example, that effect is going to be felt upstream through all muscles. All muscles have to react to that change in position. The first thing that's going to react is likely the hip, and hip goes, hey, I know that foot is doing this, therefore I have to like kind of compensate inward, and then we think we have a knee issue, and we think we have a knee cave issue, but in reality, it was more of a foot strength issue or a foot stability issue. And it certainly, there was probably some cleanup stuff that we had to do at the hip, but if you're only ever addressing hip, when you have knee problems, you're never likely to fix them really permanently. Same thing with the shoulder complex. A lot of people have really nagging shoulders. Maybe they experience a little anterior shoulder capsule issues. Maybe they feel like they don't have good external rotation. So, and I know I've been guilty of this. The first thing that we might do is we go, okay, man, shoulder's buggy and I can't quite get into this externally rotated position. So I'm going to do banded external rotations, maybe on a cable machine, some of these, and I'm going to do reps there. Maybe I'm going to do some rotator cuff issues, sideline on a bench, and that is going to improve your shoulder external rotation. But we have to first ask the question, why did shoulder external rotation become limited? Why did that capacity or the total range of motion that that shoulder can go through become limited? We have to go back through the hierarchy. We have to look at spinal mechanics. So we say, all right, spinal mechanics, the thoracic spine, first of all, sets the foundation for the shoulder complex. If thoracic spine is junky, if it's really stuck flexed, if it doesn't move a whole lot, the shoulders will compensate around that. The shoulders are still going to get the job done, but they're going to do it in a different way than maybe what is optimal. Remember, your body's always going to go from point A to point B. It's going to do whatever you tell it to, but just because it got to that point B spot doesn't necessarily mean that that path was as efficient as possible. There was probably a couple turns along the way versus a straight path. So in that shoulder complex example, if I have someone with a really locked up thoracic spine, those people will always experience a lack of shoulder external rotation. But it's not the fault of shoulder rotation purely, it's the fault of thoracic spine. And we know that if somebody has a locked up thoracic spine, always, 99% of the time, they're also going to show breathing dysfunction. Thoracic spine is really connected to rib cage function, and rib cage function is completely dependent on how well you breathe. Now, the ribs, most people just think about the bony landmarks of the ribs, the things that we see in a skeleton, but in reality, the rib cage it has connective tissue and muscles in between each of those, and as you breathe, those muscles need to expand and contract, expand and contract. If they don't do that, and if we find that they're a little tight, what's going to happen is your breathing patterns are going to become short. They're going to become shallow. That looks like chest breathing. It looks like shoulders elevating in different exercise. Maybe in a squat, you breathe like this. That's all whenever your body does that, it's trying to find space because the rib cage hasn't done this. So you breathe up here so your body can have space to actually take oxygen in. The problem with that is you are now using all of your accessory breathing muscles, which is going to negatively affect the function of your thoracic spine. Because you are always up here and your rib cage is not doing this, remember, rib cage expands here, but it also extends posteriorly. And if that rib cage isn't doing this, the rib cage is going to tighten up, your thoracic spine is going to tighten up, and then you're going to end up back in this kind of kyphotic flexion dominant position. And then you're going to go, oh, shoulder hurts, I need to do this, but this is never going to fix this position. And this position preceded any shoulder dysfunction you have. So this is our starting hierarchy for movement. All movement systems are an imperfect system, and there's always going to be rules that can break this. But the point is you have to know why the system is set up the way that it is before you start jumping around. If I have somebody who has really nagging shoulders, maybe they have bicep issues from squatting or deadlifting, or even benching, that's very common, I might just jump right to working on the shoulder for that person just to get them out of that pain. But we need to look at the thing that drove it. We need to look at what the painless compensators were in that individual. Everybody can experience pain and they kind of know what it feels like, but it's less common to dig down deeper to what the root causes of your movement. So this is a very hybrid type look at this in our Principles of Loaded Movement course. We spent about 45 minutes just on this one slide. We have a few more locations set up. We're going to Austin, Texas here in just 2 weeks. We're going to be in Chicago shortly after that. Then we're going to be back in Portland. So I think we have 3 left this year if you want to happen to dive down and see how myself and the rest of the Kabuki strength coaches actually improve movement with our athletes and trainees.